Where are you looking and what do you see? Are you focused on faith where saves victory? Where are you looking and what do you see? In faith there is victory. Where is your heart? Where are you looking and what do you see? Are you focused on faith where saves victory?
This is Focus on Faith, and I'm your host, Glenn Colley. I know that you're like me. I love to study the Bible, and because of that, I love a well thought out, well presented sermon. Now, sermons can be divided into two major categories, expository and topical. An expository sermon is one in which the preacher simply takes a passage of Scripture and explains it bit by bit. But a topical sermon, on the other hand, is one in which he would pick a subject and then read various passages all through the Bible that shed light on that subject. I've brought one to you today that is topical and on a very challenging issue. When I was a child, I would sometimes go to the carnival. They'd come to town a couple of times a year. And we didn't have too much money, but we always took in a ride or two. Now, my folks would not let me spend money on the gambling games because they would say it's wrong to gamble. In some parts of our country, gambling is a greater temptation to people than in others. I spent a week preaching in a state recently that's known for its horse racing. I mean, it's a major industry. Sometimes Christians work in that industry and have struggles with the rightness or wrongness of what they do. Could you discuss this with someone intelligently from the Bible if they ask you questions? Sometimes people defend buying lottery tickets or playing the ponies or going to Tunica or Las Vegas by saying, all of life is a gamble. You gambled when you got in your car today, or every farmer is a gambler, or investing in the stock market is certainly gambling. Well, it's true that we take chances every day, but does that mean that we're all gamblers? And besides, since there is risk in many of the normal things we do, what makes betting on a football game any different? Isn't one risk about the same as another? Don Blackwell is a friend of mine and a good thinker on such subjects. I want us to listen to a lesson now which he recently presented on the subject of gambling. After he's finished, I'll be back for the wrap-up.
I'm Don Blackwell, and I want to talk to you today about a very prevalent social and moral problem in our country today, and that is the subject of gambling. You know, sometimes when people talk about gambling, the conversation will go something like this. The person will say, I have a friend who likes to play the lottery, and I was telling him the other day that it's wrong. And he asked me why. And so I got to thinking about it, and I could not come up with a verse in the Bible that addresses it. And so I started searching, and quite frankly, there's not one. I've always been told that gambling is wrong, but I can't find a single verse that even addresses this particular topic. Well, friends, you know it's true that there is no verse in the Bible that says, thou shalt not play blackjack. But it's not the case that the Bible does not address the subject of gambling. There are a number of Bible principles that are violated by gambling and that come into play in answering this question, and that do indeed teach that gambling is wrong. Now, I've spent some time trying to think of some Bible principles of great substance that are violated by gambling, because oftentimes people will make arguments that are weak, that really don't accomplish the task in pointing out that gambling is a sin. For instance, I've sometimes heard people argue, well, you know, gambling is wrong because the Bible teaches that we are to work for our money. Well, it's certainly true. The Bible does teach that we are to work for our money. There's no doubt about that. But you know, if that argument is taken at face value, that would condemn giving someone a gift. But that's not accurate. You know, it's all right for us to accept gifts. It's all right for us to give to the poor, to give to those who are in need, and certainly it would not be wrong for them to accept it. You think about when the church helps the needy. If this principle were absolutely true to the uttermost, then I as a needy person would be wrong to accept that because I didn't earn it, I didn't work for it, and we know that that's not accurate. Now, someone might say that gambling is wrong because of the risk factor. Well, gambling is not wrong because of the risk factor. You know, risk in and of itself is not wrong. Life itself is a risk. When you get in the car and travel somewhere, you are certainly taking a risk. Being a Christian is a risk, especially in the first century. It was risky to be a member of the Lord's church. You may remember in the parable of the talents, the one-talent man was condemned because he would not take a risk. When a farmer plants a crop, he has taken a risk. Well, that doesn't mean that he sinned. You see, risk in and of itself is not something sinful. And so we need to be very careful about the arguments that we make. And I think oftentimes in Christianity, the truth suffers because we make arguments that are weak. All right, the first thing I want to do as we begin this study is to define gambling. What are we talking about when we discuss gambling? There are three basic elements that need to be considered. Number one, involved in gambling is an uncertain or arbitrary event. Number two, we have the wager, something of value like money that is deliberately chanced on a particular outcome. And number three, you have a winner and a loser. And the winner wins at the direct loss of the other gamblers. Now, when all of these elements exist together, what you have is gambling. Now, I want to talk about some Bible reasons why gambling is wrong. What are some Bible principles that are violated by gambling? First, I want to talk about the principle of covetousness. Now, you know the Bible directly teaches that covetousness is wrong. Now, let's consider this question. What is it that motivates men to gamble? Just think about that for a minute. What motivates men to gamble? Two things immediately come to my mind: greed and covetousness. You know, under the law of Moses, one of the 10 Commandments was, "Thou shalt not covet." Now that means you're not to lust after, you're not to long for, you're not to desire that which belongs to someone else. Exodus 20 and verse 17 says, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is thy neighbor's." Now what about the money that's on the table? How are you going to sit around the table and gamble at a poker game and not violate this principle? You know, in Luke 12 and 15, Jesus said, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things which he possesses." Why is gambling wrong? Because it motivates men to do something that's sinful, and that is to covet. Secondly, I want to suggest that gambling is wrong because it preys on the weaknesses of others. You know, Christian principles teach just the opposite of this. Christian principles teach, "As you therefore have opportunity, let us do good unto all men," Galatians 6 and verse 10. Now, this would involve helping those in need, not taking their money. Christian principles teach us to help the poor and to feed the hungry. But you see, gambling steals from the poor and it robs the hungry. In fact, I have heard it said that the busiest day in Atlantic City casinos is the day after welfare checks are sent out. People who can least afford it are in the casinos hoping to strike it big. You know, a gambler may win at the loss of one who can least afford it. It preys on the weaknesses of others. A disproportionate number of people who play the lottery are the very poor. They take food out of their children's mouths, hoping to win the lottery. In fact, one particular study found that the poor bet approximately 3 times the amount wagered by persons in the middle and upper income brackets. Now, what are we saying? We're saying that gambling preys on the weaknesses of others. It profits on the pain of others. It is exactly the opposite of what Christianity teaches. Thirdly, I want to suggest to you that gambling is wrong because it fails the fruit test. You might say, what are you talking about? It fails the fruit test. You know, in Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 20, Jesus laid down a test by which every activity or every philosophy could be measured. Jesus said that every good tree brings good fruit. And He said that every bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Now, I know the context there is talking about false teachers, but it is certainly a true principle with regard to the activities of life. Well, let's ask this question. What kind of fruit does gambling produce? You know, when legalized gambling arrives in a new community, does it raise the moral standards of that community? Does it help to lessen the hardships of families in that community? Or is it just the opposite? Friends, I want to suggest to you that it is just the opposite. I know that many times if you drive into a state that has legalized gambling, whether it's the lottery or casino-filled strip, many times when you come into that state, you will see billboards, and it will have the face of a person who's won $10 million, and they're smiling brightly along these roadside billboards. And you might see that, and you might think to yourself, well, you know, the lottery is a good thing. It's not a good thing. Gambling does not pass the fruit test. I read that 8 months after casinos opened in Gulfport, Mississippi, the Gulfport Police Department noted the following: murder increased by 75%, rape increased by 200%, robbery increased by 311%, assault increased by 64%, burglary increased by 100%, and vehicle theft increased by 160%. 3 years after casinos arrived, Atlantic City went from 50th to 1st in per capita crime. Now, someone might say, well, what about the great state of Nevada? You know, the home of Las Vegas, probably the gambling capital of the United States. I read that Nevada ranks 1st in suicide, 1st in divorce, 1st in high school dropouts, 1st in homicide against women, at the top in gambling addictions, that's not surprising, 3rd in bankruptcies, 3rd in abortion, 4th in rape, 4th in out-of-wedlock births, 4th in alcohol-related deaths, 5th in crime, 6th in the number of prisoners locked up, and last in voter participation. Now, somebody might say, well, you know, that's not all due to gambling. There are other factors involved here. You know, they've got drinking and prostitution and other things that may be contributing to that. Friends, I don't doubt that for a second. But isn't it interesting how these things go together, the drinking and the prostitution and the gambling? Friends, I want to suggest to you that gambling miserably fails the fruit test. Number 4, I want to suggest to you that Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 11 has bearing on this discussion of gambling. You know, one thing that people sometimes say is there aren't any verses in the Bible that deal with gambling. I was studying the subject of gambling recently, and I ran across a verse that was very interesting. Proverbs 13 and verse 11. The King James reads this way: "Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labor shall increase." Now, the word vanity here caught my attention because the word vanity means emptiness. It means nothingness. And so I thought to myself, wealth gotten by emptiness. I thought that sounds kind of like gambling. And so I started looking it up in other translations. The English Standard Version says, "Wealth gained hastily will dwindle." But it has a footnote that says, "Wealth gained by fraud." And I thought that sounds like gambling. Another translation I looked this up in says, "Wealth from get-rich-quick schemes quickly disappears. Wealth from hard work grows." Another translation says, "Wealth from gambling quickly disappears." And I thought, very interesting. Wealth from gambling. Brethren, I think that there is a principle in this particular verse which reflects directly on gambling in a negative way. Number 5, I want to suggest to you that gambling is addictive in its nature. Do you know what happens to people who win at gambling? Not the losers. Do you know what happens to people who win? They want to win again. And they want more, and they want more. And their greed and their covetousness gets out of control until they allow it to take control of their lives. And it has happened so many times that we have organizations in this country such as Gamblers Anonymous. One preacher in Texas said that in his state, on the back of lottery tickets, there is a gambler's helpline. Now, that's very interesting to me. This preacher said that he called the number and he asked them to send him some information about gambling. And very interesting, according to the information he received, do you know what the biggest gambling problem was in the state of Texas? It was the lottery. It led with 73%. According to a popular columnist, one study revealed that 43% of those who gamble have a tendency toward compulsion that results in spending more money than they can afford to spend. One article that I was reading online referenced the Dallas Times-Herald from a number of years ago, and it talked about a pawn shop owner who had patrons who would pawn their false limbs. In one case, pawned a glass eye. In one case, pulled out gold teeth with pliers to hawk them for gambling money. Now that's addiction. You know, in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 12, the New King James, the Apostle Paul wrote this, "I will not be brought under the power of any." Well, Paul, what do you mean by that? What do you mean you won't be brought under the power of any? Listen to another version. Paul says, "I will not engage in any things which might get such a grip on me that I cannot easily stop when I want to." What's he saying? He's talking about this addictive nature. He said, I'm not going to do that. But such is the nature of gambling. Number 6, I want to point out that gambling also violates the principle of stewardship. Gambling is poor stewardship. You know, in Matthew 25, we read about the parable of the talents, and we oftentimes use this parable to teach that we ought to use our talents in the service of God. And certainly that's not a misuse. But you know, the word talent in that passage is not talking about our abilities. The word talent in that passage is referred to as a unit of money, like we might use the term dollar. And some people think that this is specifically dealing with stewardship of our money in this particular parable. Now, whether that's the specific point or not, certainly it has application here. Now, the point of that parable is that God expects us to be good stewards of our money or whatever blessings we possess. And the one-talent man was not a good steward. Now, how does that relate to gambling? How does this stewardship principle relate to gambling? Let's talk about statistics for a minute. The odds of winning the lottery, of course, it depends on where you play and a number of factors, but I read that the odds vary from 18 million to 1 all the way to 120 million to 1. Those are not good odds either way. But consider this with me, and I'm going to use the larger number, 120 million to 1. The odds of being struck by lightning are 2,650,000 to 1. Now that means you are 45 times more likely to die from lightning strike than you are to win the lottery. You are 120 times more likely to die from a flesh-eating bacteria than to win the lottery. The chances of playing golf with 3 of your friends and 2 of you getting a hole-in-one in the same hole are higher than your chances of winning the lottery. You are 1,200 times more likely to die from a snake bite or a bee sting than to win the lottery. And this is very interesting. If you drive 10 miles to purchase a lottery ticket, you are 20 times more likely to be killed in a car accident along the way than you are to win the jackpot. Now, 2 of the biggest lottery programs, Powerball and Mega Millions. I want to talk about those for a minute. For Powerball, the odds of winning the jackpot with any given ticket are 1 in 146,107,962. For Mega Millions, the odds are 1 in 175,711,536. These are higher than the odds that we were talking about just a minute ago. These odds of winning either one of these, essentially, the odds are 0. You've got a 0% chance of winning. What if you went to your financial manager, your fellow at Charles Schwab or Edward Jones Investments or whatever the place is, your broker, and you found out that he was sinking a certain portion of your retirement funds into something that had a 0% chance of making money, or a 1 in 175 million chance of being successful? Would you consider him to be a good steward? How long would it take you, in fact, to fire him? Friends, the lottery is sinful because the Lord holds us accountable for our stewardship. I heard one man describe the lottery as a tax on people who can't do math. Now, what did he mean by that? What he meant is people who understand the odds, they don't play the lottery. Number 7, I want to suggest to you that gambling violates the principle of influence, the influence principle. Friends, even people in the world view gambling as a vice. It's considered an adult activity. In most states that have legalized gambling, a person must be 18 years old even to purchase lottery tickets. And you've probably seen these commercials on television that say what goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas. And they'll show gambling and alcohol and activities. And there's a reason why Vegas is called Sin City. And it's because gambling and other things are considered vices, even by the world. You know, a Christian who plays the lottery is devastating his influence. You know, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, the Apostle Paul said, if eating meat causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again. 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 13. And Paul was so concerned about his influence. He was so concerned about the effect that he would have on those around him. He would never do something again, even something that was allowed if it caused a problem, much less something that violated Christian principles such as gambling. You know, James 1:27 says, pure and undefiled religion involves keeping yourself unspotted from the world. There's an old proverb that states, in a bet, there is a fool and there is a thief. And I would mention this, neither one does well for my reputation. Gambling hurts my influence. All right, I want us to consider some objections that are made in defense of gambling. Sometimes people will say, well, there's not a verse in the Bible that says not to do it. Well, we already talked about this a little bit. There's not a verse that says thou shalt not play blackjack, but there are many verses that condemn it in principle. And Proverbs 13:11, I believe, does apply to this in a direct way. Secondly, sometimes people say, well, all of life is a risk. And we discuss the fact gambling is not wrong because of the risk. Number three, sometimes we'll say, well, you know, gambling is really no different from investing in the stock market. Ladies and gentlemen, that's simply not true. The stock market is not an artificial risk. You profit or lose in the stock market based on the economic performance of a company. In the stock market, you don't seek to gain at the direct loss of others. In economic gain, all profit by the exchange of goods and services. In the stock market, there is a legitimate exchange taking place. Your money is going and working for you, profiting. It is profiting from letting someone else use your money. And the Bible teaches profiting from letting someone else use your money is not a sin, but in fact is an honest economic principle. Matthew 25:14 through 30. Number four, good comes from it. Someone might say, well, you know, good comes from gambling. You know, this is a lie that so many states have used. So many politicians have set forth this as a way to bring legalized gambling into their particular states. You know, they'll say, well, we're going to use it for education. It's the education lottery. Or they'll say it's going to be good for our economy. I would first point out that this is one of the favorite arguments of the devil. And he uses it in so many different areas. Think about abortion. They say, well, you know, stem cell research comes from abortion and that saves lives. Think about the use of alcohol. You hear some today saying, well, there are health benefits of alcohol. It's good for your heart. Think about gambling. Some people are saying, well, it's good for the economy. Michael Fitzgerald, who is a columnist for the Stockton, California Record, or at least was, he deals with the economic argument for gambling, and specifically he's talking about casinos. He says not so. Is it good for the economy? Is it good for a community? He says not so. And he cites a 1994 study out of the University of Illinois that indicated that the social problems created by gambling, such as gambling addiction, domestic abuse, suicide, crime, indebtedness, etc., he says the social problems outweigh by far any benefit to the community. In fact, he says the gambling enterprise costs taxpayers $3 for every $1 of state revenue collected. Additionally, another university study found that counties with casinos soon have double the bankruptcy rates of counties without casinos. Friends, don't buy this benefit argument. And besides that, the Bible teaches that it's never right to do wrong. And when Christians begin reasoning that way, thinking that we will do wrong, that good may come, we have really gotten ourselves in big trouble. Number five, sometimes people will say, well, I only spend $1 a week. I only buy one lottery ticket per week. I'm not wasting that much money. It's just a cheap way for me to have some fun, and it gives me something to hope for. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want something to hope for, may I suggest to you that you lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, Matthew 6 and verse 20. And regardless of what you say, you are wasting money. $1 per week, that's $52 per year. That could help a missionary in Africa teach the gospel. It could make a lot of difference. And certainly, you're hurting your influence. It is going to be hard to turn around and talk to someone behind you about the gospel when you're in line to buy lottery tickets. And you know this argument that I only do it a little bit. What if we applied that to some other areas? What if someone said, well, I only look at a little bit of pornography. You know, I only use the Lord's name in vain a little bit. I only cheat on my taxes just a little bit. You see, that's not a valid argument. Well, what about some questions? Someone might ask, what about sweepstakes? What about door prizes? You go to a party and there's a door prize or a company's giving away something in a drawing. It didn't cost me anything. They're just giving it away. Would it be wrong for me to take that? Would it be wrong for me to enter my name into the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes? No, I don't believe that would be wrong. Why? First, it doesn't fit the definition of gambling. Remember, there are three basic elements of gambling. In the sweepstakes, there's no wager. It doesn't cost you anything. And the winner doesn't win at the direct loss of others. Really, what it amounts to is a gift. Someone might say, well, what about cake raffles? You go somewhere and a school might be having a cake raffle and a student will come and say, I want you to buy a ticket and it only costs $1 and you can buy as many as you like and the person who wins this raffle is going to get the cake. Would it be wrong for a Christian to do that? Would it be wrong? Would it be gambling to participate in that? And certainly it would. That would be gambling, and a Christian should not participate in it. It meets the elements of gambling. Friends, gambling is a blight on our society. Damage comes from it. It violates Christian principles, and it is something that a child of God should certainly steer away from. It is destructive to his influence, it's destructive to communities, and it does great harm to the cause of Christ. We appreciate you tuning in today.
You know, that was an interesting and insightful sermon on gambling. Did you get the definition for gambling that Don gave us? Number one, an uncertain or arbitrary event. Number two, something wagered. And number three, a winner and loser, and the winner wins at the loss of the loser. I don't gamble. You see, it's inconsistent with the principle that the Lord taught us about ethics and our fellow man. He said, therefore, all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them. Or the way that it was written on my elementary school ruler, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Now remember, no one ever gambles hoping to lose. If I gamble with you, I'm hoping you lose what you'd like to keep so I can win it and have it for myself. You see, it's frankly the opposite of the golden rule. I'm Glenn Colley, and this is Focus on Faith. Have a good day.
Where is your heart?